Hello, welcome to our roundtable discussion, promoted by the Civitas Solis Institute. We are here at the Institute's headquarters for the launch of the book, Western Gnosis, From Ancient Greek Mysteries to Contemporary Esoteric Currents. To start this conversation, I'd like to ask you, Anna, tell us what motivated you to write your article.
Thank you, Vanessa. Well, the theme of Gnosis is a topic that has always motivated me. And when I received the invitation to write this article, in addition to being a motivation, it was a happy opportunity for me to return to a subject that I had studied before, which was the issue of the mysteries. I had studied it during my master's degree years, about 15 years ago, and on that occasion, I dealt with the Greek mysteries and the question of ascesis within the mysteries themselves, that is, where the ascetic element can be found and where it cannot. So what I was really dealing with was the Gnostic element. But I couldn't quite talk about this in a philosophical, academic environment. So now, this invitation from Civitas Solis was such a great gift. For me, because it allowed me to return to this topic in a more mature and synthetic way, going straight to the point of what I would really like to have said.
Great. I'd like to highlight that we have here today 5 authors, but the book has other authors and other very interesting articles. And for you, Jurasi, what was it like to participate to write this article for this book?
So, I'm going to give you a more personal answer, right? Regarding that. For me, writing about this article wasn't something that was on the horizon at the beginning of my quest, okay? I ended up coming across the Valentinian tradition, and as I searched for some answers, you see, I was a young man who happened to attend a certain evangelical church. And then I realized that some understandings seemed relatively contradictory to me. I wanted to know, for instance, why the resurrection of Jesus was revealed to women and not a man. And it just wasn't that important to that church. And men always played the more important roles there. So there were always some questions that I had. So at a certain point, I ended up coming across the Valentinian tradition. My search went like this, in this way. Whether it was to understand a historical context and actually find some answers to some questions that I had in my mind, right? It was part of my honest search regarding to what was written in the scriptures, and that ended up giving me greater meaning. As I researched and found answers in those sources about, in a real sense, what really happened at that time.
In my case, with my article on perennial philosophy during the Renaissance, this topic has a lot to do with my master's degree research, whose topic belonged to a related area, namely Ficino's Prisca Theologia. So it was easy for me in that sense, because it was already a topic that was part of my research repertoire. However, the big challenge was precisely to adapt the language of the article and its size to make it compatible with a proposal that was not exactly academic. It was something more fluid, essay-like, something less verbose and more straight to the point, but without giving up a certain rigor, a coherence. So it was challenging in that sense. Anthroposophy, it was a little different, because it was not my academic research topic, but this is an esoteric spiritual movement with which I had some contact when I was younger. I even attended some groups. I read more Steiner at the time, so it was like going back to my adolescence years and returning to an author for whom I always had affection and respect. And now I could also confront him in this intermediate proposal, which wasn't quite a very academic format, nor it was a merely superficial or cliche text either. That is what it was about for me, sort of.
Perfect. What about the book project itself? What motivated you to participate in this specific project?
Thanks for the question again, Vanessa. Well, I think firstly the issue of bringing together so many researchers from different areas, themes, and places. It's a challenge here in Brazil to start an academic or intellectual collaboration project between researchers and really come up with an exchange, a process of mutual learning. So I found this very interesting about the book's project proposal. Secondly, I also think that it is a work that, in our context, was pioneering work, an innovative work, publishing a collection on Western esotericism in such a way that was not so strictly academic, but not superficial. That was also a challenge from an intellectual and organizational point of view. And finally, also, I think this counts, who made the invitation, right? The Civitas Solis Institute. I already knew its work and had some participation here. And I thought that the credibility of the Institute, the scope of the proposal, would generate work of great quality. I believe that is what we are seeing here.
I really appreciate your answer. Thanks. In this book, we also have a very interesting article about Neoplatonism. So I wanted to ask you now, Danilo, tell me something. How does your article relate to the culture of the time?
Thank you, Vanessa. My article about Neoplatonic theory shows us a current of spirituality, about the thought of antiquity, a time in which we see people who were faced with a traditional culture in ruins, a culture of many centuries that was disappearing. It was losing strength, and they suddenly gained custody of it themselves. We are therefore talking about philosopher priests, who became priests of the whole world, within their own schools, within their own precincts that transposed the barriers of time and space in this sense, thus allowing the conservation of this culture, these traditions and these very practices. And I believe that in a way, we, who have an interest in these traditions and in these cultures and ways of thinking, we also need to be like them in a way. So I see that we are very much connected with them, despite being so far away historically, but we are faced with a similar mission.
Perfect, thanks for your answer. Another very interesting article that we have in this book is the article written by the Institute's president, Adelmo Avancini, which is the article about the Golden Rosy Cross. I would like to ask how you see the connection of your own article with the other ones.
There is a direct correlation with some of these articles. For example, there is an article by an author who is not present here today about the 17th century Rosicross. And this is perhaps the most direct correlation, as seen in the name of the school itself, namely the Spiritual School of the Golden Rosicross, which took as inspiration precisely this movement from the 17th century. And there was a whole effort by the founders to recover these original texts from the original Rosicross and translate them into a language understandable to people today. So they wrote long commentaries on each of these three manifestos, the Fama Fraternitatis, the Confessio, and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. So this is the most direct relationship. But keep in mind that this school proposed to be an initiatory school for the present day. We can trace this conception to Anna's article, to the very beginning of this development, to the ancient Greek mysteries and the Dionysian and Orphic mysteries, regarding which the founder of the Rosicross, Reichenborg, also wrote articles about. So this attempt to recover this initiatory wisdom and update it for modern-day human beings was the lifelong attempt of the founders of the Rosicross. Furthermore, if we take, for example, Gerassi's article on the Valentinians, that is, about a lineage of Gnostic Christianity. Also in this regard, the founders always sought to make connections between current wisdom and the classical wisdom of Gnostic Christianity. They even wrote several conferences about these texts of Gnostic Christianity. There is a book they published particularly with detailed explanations about the Gospel of Pistis Sophia. Thus, there are several correlations. The very concept of Daniel's article on perennial philosophy is something one can also find within the Golden Rosicross. which also sees a universal teaching, a universal doctrine, a perennial philosophy that transcends the whole history of humanity. So there are several relationships, and I would also include the relationship with Rudolf Steiner's own work, okay? Because the initiation school itself, which was established within the spiritual school of the Golden Rosy Cross, took it as a foundation too, the work of other pioneers. So there are several references in the work of the founders. The works of Helena Blavatsky, those of Rudolf Steiner, the work of Max Heindel, and even the inner structure of this school as an inner school, like its inner degrees, was also influenced by the pioneering works of these other authors. So there are various correlations, because the very foundation for the work of the Rosy Cross is also Gnosis.
Thank you very much, Adelmo. I thank not only you, but also Claudio Moraes, co-author of this article, who is not here today, but who participated in this wonderful article. And when it comes to perennial philosophy, I have one more question for you, Daniel. How do your articles relate to today's spiritual quest?
Thanks, Vanessa, for the question. With my specific topic, there is a researcher that I quote in an article called James Heiser. He makes a correlation between the perennial philosophy today and the Renaissance, right? That is my focus. And in fact, it is a theme that he brought up again due to there being various groups, movements, some even politicized, or not necessarily spiritual, or some that do not separate the two spheres, which take up this term, this conception. And in a way, the article will be an opportunity to see the genesis of this concept. In Ficino and Pletho and other authors in Agostino Stucco, they're the genesis of the perennial philosophy. Of course, with differences from what we see now in this period, right, in the current context. I think it's a bit like that.
Great. And the key question of this conversation, I imagine, is the very title of the book itself, right? Western Gnosis. So for you authors, what is Gnosis? I would like to start with you, Ana Casaretti.
Gnosis, in my view, in a very simple definition, is knowledge that transcends time. And what is this knowledge? It is knowledge of principles, of immutable principles, and among these principles is our origin, the origin of man. So, among the postulates of these various strands of which we write about here, among these postulates that are spoken of here, there is something that remains, namely the idea of a principle of unity and a principle of multiplicity, if we are to use philosophical terms. So there is a principle of unity that is unchanging. And there is everything else, that which is subject to change and corruption and death, which is where we are. And there is the principle of unity. This is important to understand, how the gnosis process works as well. The principle of unity has a force and an attribute of a centripetal force, which it pulls towards itself. And then if you imagine a great core, it draws the realities that are outside of itself closer to itself through this force. And these realities then acquire something of this immutable principle. So we have several different strands. We have Platonic ideas, the Pythagorean Decad, the Sephiroth of Hebrew mysticism, the highest levels of the first angelic realm. So we have these levels that are part of the mutable realm. But they have something that they retain from the immutable principle. This will be transmitted. But man also has another attribute, which is the attribute of a centrifugal force. He moves away from him that which does not suit him. In the case of time, and we are within time. And there are existences superior to ours and inferior to ours, but within time itself. So what is the issue here? Gnosis has been repeating itself. It comes as an echo. It comes as a memory that is transmitted by the one to these other levels, but it is a process of return. This return is precisely about returning to that principle of unity. And then all the various movements of ascesis come into play. liturgy, rituals, and all spiritual searches are aimed at making this return, which begins with a reminiscence, which is given by the touch of Gnosis.
Great. Anyone cares to comment on that?
Adelmo?
Gnosis can also be understood as access to the most intimate truth of being. We live deluded by egocentric consciousness, and we identify with it so much that we normally consider this to be our true reality of being. But the reality of being more intimate to the human is actually something much more fundamental and profound. In the context of Rosy Cross, we speak of the spiritual spark that awakens in the human heart and that awakens human consciousness. And in this awakening of human consciousness, the human being is first led to a process of self-knowledge. He begins to unmask his identifications with external elements. The human being is identified with an image created by his mental process, which is the ego. You are deeply identified with your way of thinking, with your way of feeling, with your way of acting. But all of these are like external layers, the deepest reality. All of this makes us forget this most intimate reality. But when this spark awakens and manifests itself with human science, the human being can begin a process of self-knowledge, which is also a process of self-unmasking of these illusions, so that one's consciousness becomes increasingly a mirror of this most profound truth deep inside, because this spark manifests itself as a restlessness that leads to spiritual search. But it is also the light of self-knowledge, and it is wisdom. In the Corpus Hermeticum, it is said that the wisdom that comes from this spark is Sophia. Sophia thinking in silence. And this Sophia opens up a space of perception for the human being and makes room for this more intimate wisdom that springs from this spark. So Gnosis is precisely this Sophia, this wisdom that comes from the depths of being, and that manifests itself to consciousness, and that transforms consciousness itself, because it is not simply about modifying your conceptions of the world, but also about transforming one's own life. So in this sense, Gnosis is something that can be brought into our daily life practice. It is not just a theory, it is a life practice that is born from the connection with that spiritual spark.
Great. Danilo, would you like to comment on that?
Thank you very much.
We have seen in the religious and philosophical history of humanity that not all spiritual traditions aim at some kind of salvation and liberation from our finite and mortal condition. Some of these traditions simply embraced our mortality as it is and finitude as it is without seeking anything beyond that. And in fact, they proposed a way of harmonizing ourselves with our environment. But other types of spirituality postulate something that transcends this condition, and therefore transcends the finite and mortal condition of our identity, and our existence and daily life. But not all of these spiritual traditions, which posit a transcendent end, understand that this transcendent end also somehow dwells within us as our true identity and as our true core. And I believe that Gnosis is nothing more than just any form of spirituality that postulates a transcendent end, but also postulates that the very ultimate identity of our core is one with that transcendent end itself. Because in my article, for example, I talk about Neoplatonic theurgy. There is an elaborate description there of the process of ascension of the soul towards transcendence. But when the soul encounters the principle of principles, that which transcends everything and that which everything tends to, What the soul finds there is actually itself.
In view of what you all mentioned, I would summarize it very simply by saying the following: Gnosis is about true knowledge. Knowledge that you do not acquire through books or only through your education, through what you were taught. It is direct knowledge. It is something that you intuit, something that is part of your being. And that seeks you and that leads you to seek the divine, in other words. Does this make sense to you in a very summarized way?
Yes, it does make sense, Vanessa. And I would like to bring a little bit of the view of anthroposophy to this discussion. Steiner takes up a phrase which I think is from Plotinus. The objective of anthroposophy, which is a form of gnosis, is unite the spirit that is within man with the spirit that is within the universe. And Steiner in particular greatly emphasized that this process of self-knowledge, of knowing the divine identity within man, must also go through something practiced in the concrete world. That's why he emphasized and created so many things such as Waldorf pedagogy, biodynamic agriculture, the issue of the threefold nature of the social organism. So Steiner was not an occultist or an esotericist with his head in the clouds. On the contrary, he wanted to bring it to the reality of the time and to the problems of concrete man, modern man. So there is a dialectic process in this. Gnosis is a perennial, eternal, and immemorial traditional thing, but it also adapts to the conditions of each moment, of each time, and each culture. Such was, in a way, Steiner's vision, at least on that.
Yes, he sought to bring the topic more concretely into people's daily lives. Right? What do you have to say about it, Jurasir?
I think it got a little complicated because now different authors have talked about the meaning of gnosis, right? They even ended up getting into part of what I wanted to say. However, I was thinking, and just a quick note here, trying to complement what was said. When we talk about gnosis, we also talk about full knowledge, right? But in what sense can we also, I can comment on this knowledge? I ended up remembering another poll, okay? I comment in my article that in the Valentinian tradition, particularly, they are precisely between two competing poles. The Judaism of that time and a Messianic Judaism, and on the other hand, Christianity, which will emerge in parallel with Gnosticism itself, okay? Unlike many people, Christianity will be born. In fact, in the first century, we see Messianic Judaism. And in the second century, historically speaking, both will emerge in parallel, both Gnosticism and Christianity. They will emerge as philological phenomena in a way. Both are there seeking an interpretation of the scriptures. Both are seeking an understanding of the meanings of philosophical and religious concepts, okay? So they appear together in that sense. And what I want to bring up specifically about gnosis to the Valentinian tradition, for example, is that it does not leave the Greek form of knowledge aside, nor the Christian form of knowledge aside, which would be a mystical union with God, right? Union with God through faith. So, the Valentinian tradition will be in dialogue with these two ways of seeking knowledge and seeking full knowledge. And this is where what has been said so far comes in. Gnosis, for this tradition, the Valentinians in this case, is full knowledge and is knowledge that seeks a lived experience. It does not leave the epistemological rigor of the Greeks aside. It seeks to have historical knowledge. It wants to know what is the most appropriate way to interpret sacred texts. And it doesn't leave faith aside because in truth it still doesn't have all the ultimate knowledge. Faith is part of this process. It is like a vector of this search. So it is full in this sense of searching, understanding, and experiencing and transforming oneself. It is only fulfilled when it experiences all these ways of knowing God.
Fantastic. Dear authors, I would like to thank you very much for your participation. It was a quick conversation, but through this chat, we got to know a little bit about each article you wrote. Unfortunately, other authors could not be here to join the conversation. In any case, we invite you to acquire the book, The Western Gnosis. It's a beautiful book with such a content that it's a gem. You won't find it anywhere. Civitas Solis compiled these articles in such an exquisite way that it's worth checking out its content. Okay? Thank you very much once again, Danilo, Anna, Adelmo, Hurasir, and Daniel, and the other authors. See you in the next conversation.
Bye.